Okay. Again, welcome. This is our third public outreach for the State Water Plan Task Force State Water Plan Update. My name is Wes Couture. I am a member of the State Water Plan Task Force. Typically, this introduction is done by Mr. Lauren Wolbig. Unfortunately, he had a family issue arise this morning and is unable to join us for this meeting. So we just want to welcome everybody to this outreach. This will be the third and final outreach for the State Water Plan Task Force. And as mentioned before, we are currently holding 3 of these outreaches. One was yesterday up in Yorkville, or the Northern Illinois section. Today we are in Southern Illinois. And then on Monday at 10 a.m., we will be holding our final iteration of this public outreach there at the Department of Ag on the fairgrounds in Illinois. So I just want to welcome everybody as we kick off what is the final outreach for the State Water Plan update. So with that, just an update of what is going to be covered. We're going to go over just briefly the State Water Plan history, kind of what the plan is, how it's different from previous plans, how we can use the plans. We'll go over how the plan was developed. So these are kind of similar if you were at previous outreaches for outreach number 1 or 2. You may have heard us go over this a little bit in detail. We just want to gloss over that. And then we're going to really dive into a little bit more of the details of what the report contains, an overview of that, what's the highlights. Because the report is, 150 pages long and has 140 plus recommendations, we're not going to go over those item by item. We'd be here till probably 11 o'clock at night. And, that was those recommendations and those subject or topic specific details were included in the first and second outreaches. So just want to make sure that you guys are aware of kind of what we're covering here. And then from that, we'll kind of go on about how you can help, what the schedule looks like moving forward, including kind of the next steps, and then also where you can find more information. So a little brief history. The actual State Water Plan was first developed in 1967. Actually, it used to be a component of what was a natural resources plan back, I think it was dated back in as early as the 30s or 40s. The first actual state water plan, a plan dedicated only to water, was developed back in 1967. Actually, Illinois was one of the first states to develop a water plan. And then that was in place, and it was actually intended to last about 15 years. 13, 15 years was the intent of that 1967 plan. And then Governor Thompson appointed the task force, which was consisted of a variety of agencies that were to come together for the sole purpose of developing an update to the state water plan. And that task force first met in the summer or late spring of 1980, and is focused on policy individuals in those each of those agencies. The final report was then published in '84, and it was essentially intended to focus on policy and program guidance. What should those agencies be doing, in particular to water resources management? Also, during that course, there's a variety of special reports published on each of those individual topics. And those can all be found on the website, which we'll be speaking about later, but those were deeper dive reports on each of those certain topics. And then the State Water Plan Task Force continues to meet to this day, but between 1984 and 1994, there's a series of annual updates that were published. Essentially a status report on where they are at on implementing those recommendations, and also some new topics that came up over that decade. And essentially, 1994 was 1994. I'm sorry, was essentially the last update that was published. Just as an indication of who's a part of the State Water Plan Task Force, you see the list of the agencies. If you actually go back to the 1980 declaration by Governor Thompson, you won't see this list of agencies. Obviously, the IDNR did not exist. There's a couple of other agencies that were called different things, but this is the best equivalent to the modern day agencies that corresponded to those agencies in that 1980 declaration. So this is essentially who is a member of the task force. So what is the task force? Again, we do have our mission of developing a plan and goals to identifying those policies and programs needed with the intent of providing this to the General Assembly to develop this report. And that's kind of it. I won't read it word for word. It's there on the screen. But what this really is an opportunity. And we want to stress that this is the chance for the state agencies to come together and really create a vision for what water resources in Illinois looks like, what the programs are needed within those state agencies to meet those goals or that vision, and what legislation and what initiatives need to be undertaken to accomplish those goals to reach that vision that we have for the state of Illinois as it pertains to water management. So if you're familiar with the 1984 plan, we are changing that significantly from what was done in the past to what it will be with this iteration. The first and foremost is we have a significant focus on social and environmental justice. You'll see in the report as we dive a little deeper, there is a section solely dedicated to social and environmental justice in the report. Additionally, what we're doing is making this more available to the public. So we want a plan that's not only just put in paper and put on a shelf and hard for the public to find. What we want to do is make it so that it's readily available so that the public knows where to go to find it, but also that it can be updated on an annual or even possibly a quarterly basis on how we're accomplishing these things, sharing that data that we're discovering and developing as part of this plan, also making it available geographically by GIS web-based data. And then we will still have those paper reports maybe every 7 to 10 years to provide that formal report that we would hand in to the General Assembly. So the question is, how do we plan on using the state water plan? As we started the process, we thought this was really a policy and programs type of documents, what the initial thought was. But as we reach out to the public and work through this process and got feedback and adjusted our recommendations, we see actually there's a wide array of uses and intentions for this state water plan. Surprisingly, we're seeing that there's a lot, 13%, that's going to be incorporated potentially, where they've recommended that they are going to use this to incorporate recommendations into local comprehensive plans. We see a lot of public outreach at 20% of interest of users to use this for public outreach initiatives. Public policy reform is obviously one that we anticipate seeing, as well as requesting funding and state agency planning. But we also have this regional watershed area planning, where this isn't just a state level, but this is going to be working with local and regional stakeholders to move this initiative forward. So now I'm going to dive in a little bit to the process. Again, if you've attended previous outreaches, this may look a little familiar. I'm just updating those for who may not have been able to attend. So essentially, the first steps was to develop and organize the plan. This was getting the task force together, all agreeing that we want to undertake this effort. This isn't an initiative that was driven from the governor or the legislator. This was kind of grassroots from the state agencies saying that we want to do this. It's well overdue. So we got everybody on board with that, identified what we thought was the critical issues. We reached out to stakeholders, made sure they agreed and that we didn't overlook anything. And we essentially established those critical issues. Then we went in and started determining who's going to oversee each of those critical topics that we want included in this plan, and establish critical and consistent practices with the report. So that's all under the organized. And now we're kind of shifting into where we're at now is really under this final stage of the research and outreach component, as you see here shown on the screen, where we're soliciting that public stakeholder input. And you can read these a little bit more. Next, we're moving into officially publishing the report, combining everything, providing guidance for what our next steps are. And then as we move in the future, we're going to be providing status updates on where we are at implementing those recommendations. Just a little bit deeper dive into that public outreach. As we move through identifying and developing those critical topics, we then followed that up with our first outreach. And that was the outreach one where we said, this is our critical topics and issues, and do you agree? And we got a lot of great feedback on that, and we incorporated a lot of those comments and recommendations. That was that first December 20th outreach effort. We then moved into developing recommendations and evaluating that. And again, with that was when we moved into the second public outreach effort to get feedback on the recommendations, and we took in all that. And that's what's moved us to this final outreach effort that we're here today, is that we've taken the information from the previous outreaches, developed this draft report that we're to share with you all, and get final comments, making sure that the overall report is kind of what is kind of meeting the public's needs. Again, this is a state of Illinois water plan, and this is not just state agencies' water plan, but we want it for all of our stakeholders, all of our constituents, to make sure that we're moving forward in a consistent way. So we're really leveraging these public outreaches to garner that feedback before we officially publish, to make sure that this is the plan that the constituents and stakeholders of the state of Illinois want. This is their plan moving forward. As just mentioned, we're kind of at that final step of soliciting the final feedback. So just an overview, this is kind of a quick summary of what you may see in the table of contents. The first section will have a letter from the task force chair essentially reaching out to or essentially addressing the governor and the General Assembly that we're developing this report. Section 2 will have a agency support letter, and this is kind of an important component. While it may seem kind of standard, as we go through each of these recommendations and identifying topics, these were all vetted from each of these state agencies that were a part of it. So there have been recommendations that have been edited, removed, added to other sections, because we want to make sure that all the agencies of the task force were all in agreement with the recommendations proposed. So that really wasn't an easy feat, that we went through each and every single recommendation as a task force to make sure everybody was on board and agreement with that. So this is an opportunity to me kind of explain, if you participated in the first or second outreach and you offered recommendations or edits, and you're not seeing those in here, there could be a number of reasons why that could be. It could be that another agency had an issue with it and they couldn't promise to be able to sign off on that. It could have been that, as we may talk about a little bit in the future, that this is a 10-year plan. It's not a holistic plan that covers everything that we want to do for, as far as I can see, is what we believe we can really accomplish during that 10-year plan. So just a little bit of overview on some of that feedback we've received earlier, and why some comments have come in, some comments may not have been included into this final draft. So again, that's why it's important that we had full agency support, so that in the second section we could say that all agencies were completely on board with everything that's in this plan. The third section is an introduction. We'll dive into that a little bit more. The fourth section, as I mentioned, we have a whole section dedicated to social and environmental justice. Sections 5 through 17 is the main body of the report, where that includes those 13 critical topics that we talk about. So That's going to kind of be the meat of that material. We'll show you a kind of an example of what that's going to look like. Again, we're not going to go through every page, but we'll show you an example of what that looks like. 18 is kind of the recommendations, cross-cutting topics, and later on we'll give a little preview of that. Section 19 is the conclusion, and then follow that with the appendices. So as mentioned, kind of looking a little closer at the social and environmental justice issues, or section that we have, it's essentially focusing that the opportunities that we're presenting here is based on a fair treatment for all, and you can list all the categories that we considered when we evaluate that. So making sure that all communities are being taken care of, and that is done in a balanced way to have allow for that equal access for all individuals in Illinois. We're also focusing on environmental justice and making sure that no communities disproportionately benefited by the programs, and that those that are, that typically receive less or maybe more in need may receive that equitable share of environmental benefits and protection. It's also making sure that we're providing that in respect to public involvement, and making sure we're reaching out to those communities that may be harder to reach in various ways, whether they are less likely to have technology available and such. So then moving through later on through the rest of the section, we're talking about the 13 topics. Again, we've talked about these in the past of having those 13 topics. You can see them all listed here. In the public outreach is where we talked about the issues that were raised within those 13 topics. And then the second outreach was where we talked about the recommendations. So really those are well established, and you should be familiar with those if you've participated in the previous outreach public outreach events. I will say that while these are shown individually, there's a lot of overlap that occurs. Particularly, there's some issues such as climate change and long-term funding. They're kind of interwoven into all these other topics. You'll also see some overlap of where some sections may be very similar to others as we talk about some of the recommendations in here. And we'll kind of show how we've illustrated that in the report as well. So some of the report tools for those who may not have a strong technical background in some of these water issues, we've added some of these additional tools, whether they're acronyms that especially state and federal agency members are very familiar with. We've made sure to include a list of acronyms commonly used. Topic definitions. So this is kind of an elaboration on what these 13 topics really mean. What does it mean when we say flood damage mitigation? What does that really mean? So just kind of an expansion of what those terms mean. And then finally, we also have a key terms, which is kind of a definition of some of these terms that may be a little bit more technical in nature to help the general public understand what we really mean when we use terms like mitigation or sustainability, things like that. So this is an example of one of the 13 topic sections. As we mentioned, that's sections starting at section 5 and moving on through the 13. We'll have a paragraph that essentially gives an overview of what is water sustainability, maybe a little bit of background information on what each of those 13 topics are, followed by a write-up on what are the current issues that we're dealing with in that issue. So an explanation of what the problems are, why they are addressed in these two paragraphs. So these sections are kind of shorter. Typically, there can be anywhere from about 4 to 10 pages max, and the intent was to keep it concise. We wanted to kind of get to the main points and not have 50 pages on each of these, where it's really hard to find general information. Now, know that the committees that help develop each of these sections, for example, the Water Sustainability Committee is still utilized and will be continued to be utilized moving forward. So this is obviously just a very broad, quick overview of each of these topics, and there's been a lot more depth and discussion involved in all of these. We just didn't want to try and fit all of that information in this report. Again, the point was to be concise, to get to the General Assembly and to the governor's office so that they can quickly review it and see what the main points are that we believe should be addressed in the future. Included in that section, probably the bulk of interest will lie in the end of that section, which is the summary table of the recommendations. So as you can see in the leftmost column, we kind of have an issue that may kind of reference back to that earlier paragraph or set of paragraphs that talked about what the issue was. And then we have the corresponding recommendation. How do we want to address that issue? And so while this is only a sentence or two that's listed for the recommendations, know that there's a lot more depth, like I said, into these recommendations, a lot more details. Again, it was a balance of trying to not have a two-page write-up on a single recommendation, but we tried to make it concise, knowing that there's much more detail involved and documented within that committee that's met. The following column, the lead agencies, essentially what agencies responsible for carrying this recommendation forward. This is the agency that will be providing updates at our future State Water Plan Task Force meetings on where we are at with this initiative. And they're essentially in charge of seeing that it's gone through. They may not be doing all the work, but they're the ones that the state agency that will be kind of overseeing or maybe carrying that initiative forward. The second to last column on near the end on the right side is funding. So we wanted to kind of break down if a recommendation requires funding, if so, what type of funding. And we'll go into this in a little bit more detail, but you can see there's whether it's maintain the annual funding that's currently there or increase it, or if we need a one-time funding for some research that needs to be done. That is kind of identified in the funding column. There's just kind of a way to describe what kind of funding is expected to carry out this recommendation. And then the final column, we have an action. So this just kind of allows us to categorize each recommendation. Is this research that needs to be done? If so, maybe it's placed under study. Is this a new program that needs to be developed or a part of an existing program within a state agency? You'll see that may be listed as program. Is a piece of legislation that needs to be moved forward? It may be under policy. So those are some of those things that, again, just allows us to categorize and see, and later in this presentation, how those kind of come together and how our recommendations fall in each of those categories. So with that, I'll now introduce Tara McParland. She's been our chief editor for the State Water Plan, the lead on putting this all together. So a lot of work has been completed by Tara to pull this all together and also pull this public outreach effort together. She's the lead for the flood damage mitigation as well, and our flood program manager as well. So I'll turn it over to Tara.
All right, thanks, Wes. So let's talk a little bit about how the report was put together, and I'm just going to go over some of the maybe some of the conclusions or compile some of the results. Again, this is in the report. We're not going to talk about each recommendation, but I'm just providing a summary. I did just want to mention, I'm going to sidebar for a second, that the actual report, the PDF of the report is posted on the website, and we'll show you where in a little bit. But all those recommendations are listed in that report. So this is just, again, a compilation of the different recommendations that we currently have in the report. As Wes mentioned, we have 13 different topics. And of those 13 topics, each group has developed a variety of number of recommendations. And the total report is currently at 144 recommendations. And the other part of that, those recommendations that I wanted to mention, that Wes said, that this is just a snapshot in time. These are the topics and issues and recommendations that we feel are of utmost importance at this point in time in the state. But we recognize that as the years go on, in the next few years, we'll be completing some of these recommendations, and those committees will continue to meet and develop recommendations or changes in those recommendations, or also add recommendations that might be new and emerging. So these recommendations are of the priority right now, but they will be a moving target. And so I just wanted to make sure you understood that, again, if your recommendation didn't make it to the top of the list or part of the report, and you are aware that that those committees have talked about a lot of those other recommendations. And I personally, I'm in the flood damage mitigation lead, and in my committee, we had a list of about 50 different recommendations that we wanted to do, but we recognized that within the next 10 years, there's only so many that we could actually hope to accomplish. So keep in mind that those recommendations were selected and broken down in ways that could be completed in the next 10 years. And as well, recognize that the committees are aware of other recommendations that they'll bring forward in the next iteration and in those status reports. So this graphic actually talks about those recommendations. I just tried to break them down into different categories. And those different 13 topics, they all had different committees. And it was just interesting to me that several of those committees came up independently with the exact same recommendations. And that's, I'll be talking a little bit more about those cross-cutting impacts and how one recommendation for one topic, it easily falls within the realm of another topic. And that's the next one, are those cross-cutting topics and issues and recommendations. Of those recommendations, 29%, or almost a third of the recommendations, definitely impacted one another. And then since we have a big focus in this report was on social and environmental justice, we thought it would be good to go ahead and look to see how many recommendations have direct recommendations related to social and environmental justice. And that's not to say right now we have about 23%, or about a quarter of them, that have direct language within the recommendation to address those issues. But that said, recognize a lot of the recommendations also inadvertently are proactive for social and environmental justice. They might just not say that or spell it out directly in the language. And then we just thought it was interesting that what we're finding is there's a lot of great information out there, but definitely all agencies agree that there needs to be more outreach. And 25% of the recommendations have some facet of outreach. And then we also found out this task force says because the water is such a broad topic, we found out that a lot of agencies are doing a lot of different programs. There's a lot of information out there, but what we found is that a big recommendation, or our group of the recommendations were about collaborating and sharing that information. So the next two, talking about sharing that analysis and data collection to take the burden off of every individual agency and really share those results with each other even better than we've been doing recently. And then I'll talk a little bit more, but 112 of the recommendations require some sort of funding, and 23 of those recommendations requires legislation or policy changes. So here's just an example. There's more in the report, but these graphics are to illustrate which topic have the exact same recommendations. So if you look at the graphic, the center button-shaped circle there actually is the recommendation, and then the outlying squares are saying which specific topics have those exact same duplicate recommendations. And there's even one that had 4 different topics had the exact same recommendation. So again, it's just showing support and how these recommendations tie together. Similarly, we all the different topics and all the different recommendations and tried to just find some common themes so that we could just, again, it's more for the legislators and the people that are making the decisions, so that they could say, well, I'm a big fan of doing this additional monitoring. But then they can also recognize that that's the third item down there, additional monitoring. It was a water quality recommendation. But then they can also say, wow, but if I do those and support and provide funding for that particular recommendation topic, I'm also helping the aquatic and riparian habitat group. I'm also helping the erosion and sedimentation and the data management. And so again, it's trying to show that all the support and all the initiatives that move forward definitely impact each other in a positive manner. And then we decided to look at that one more way. Just get, we tried to look at these, looking at each recommendation and see how they impacted some of those other topics. So these graphics, there were so many, which is a good thing, that they all are cross-cutting and impacting each other. But we went ahead and put these in the appendix. So watch for these in the appendix, because there's quite a few, and it is very interesting to see how all these recommendations topics must connect with each other. So then, as Wes mentioned, we had certain categories that we were trying to track. And for the different types of funding, again, we thought the General Assembly might always wants a summary. So we wanted to really tell them that, to show them specifically how many of the recommendations needed which type of funding. So the largest type of funding is new annual, and that's at 48 of the 144 recommendations. But I think it's also important to see here, sometimes we're saying,
I lost Tara.
I did as well.
Hello. While we're waiting for Tara to come back, is it possible to ask a question?
Depends on what it is.
Yeah, I apologize. We're having some technical issues with the internet connection on site. Looks like we are up and running once again. Can I just get confirmation that you guys can hear me?
Yes.
All right, thank you. I apologize for that. Let us get running here again. Again, apologize for the update. Sometimes the internet just doesn't hold up.
Hey, Wes, it looks like you might have a couple of questions there that maybe could get answered while there's this pause.
Sure, we can.
you know what, I think we lost connection, so
Oh.
we don't have the questions anymore.
Unfortunately, yeah, when we lost connection, we lost those questions. If you want to retype those in, it looks like we're ready to go, and we'll address them towards the end. So just if you asked a question, please just retype it in the chat, or we can go back and have somebody read those. But unfortunately, when we lost connection, we lost those chat comments. Okay.
Thank you.
I apologize for that. Close this down. All right.
Okay. So back to those actions that were needed. We wanted the General Assembly to understand which of the, or what type of action would be needed from them, from the committees, from the task force, from the general public or stakeholders. By far, we found out that that most of the recommendation had some sort of program recommendation, whether it was maintaining, expanding, enhancing an existing program, or completely starting a new program. So again, we thought this was very interesting. I will digress a little bit. when we first started working on the state water plan update, there were several members of the task force that had been involved ever since the 94 and 84 updates, and they were able to report that a lot of the programs that they worked on over the last 20 years were directly related to the recommendations that were in the last state water plan updates and those recommendations. So I thought that was really helpful for us to realize that all these agencies working together and developing these recommendations. The idea is to help the General Assembly understand what's needed now and what they should be focusing on as well. And it's all been agreed by all of the agencies. So we just want you to realize that that's the purpose of the state water plan, is to help direct those future programs and funding for the next few years. Okay. So, and again, there's 28 different studies, and that's important to understand that while we want to solve all the problems immediately, just please recognize that sometimes we don't have all the information that we need to come up with all those solutions today. So some of our recommendations are to study or get additional data, review some additional analysis, and those will help us direct the programs of the future. So, and again, some are projects, actually something that will be constructible. We have policy changes as well as legislation recommendations. Oh, am I on the wrong?
Yeah, sometimes.
All right, and then we wanted to go ahead just for our own internal agency plans and staffing. We just went ahead and added up all those different lead agencies. And as Wes mentioned, the lead agency is ultimately responsible for making sure that those recommendations are completed. But recognize that most of those the task force and committees have a multitude of different members, both from the different state agencies, as well as different stakeholder groups, committees, members. So again, the lead agency is responsible, but we're just one of a large group of people working together to solve all these or to enact all these recommendations. But at the end of the day, a large group of the recommendations are being assigned to the DNR, and within DNR there are different offices. Like many agencies, DNR is quite broad in its strategies and its goals. So we did break them down by offices just to make sure it was more clear as to who was responsible for what. But as you can
We apologize. We weren't aware that we were going to have internet issues with this location. So we're going to try and call in. And again, I apologize for the delay.
Welcome to WebEx. In case you don't realize.
Okay, hopefully, can I get a thumbs up from somebody that you can now hear us on the new audio and that is hopefully improved? All right, thank you, BJ. Again, we apologize. That's the joy of working or going on location, is that sometimes the internet is not as well tested as what you'd hoped it would. But we're going to go ahead and hopefully this is the last interruption. I apologize once again, and we should be up and sharing the screen here shortly. Okay. All right.
Okay. I might go back to the previous slide just to see. Again, I hope you heard a little bit about the different agencies and the leads. This is just a summary of how they're distributed of all the different recommendations. So I wanted to mention for those because this has been a challenging presentation and you might not have heard everything, that there's going to be ways for you to look at the report and provide feedback. And I'm going to go over that in a second, but just recognize right now that there's a link at the bottom for the State Water Plan website. And on that link, if you click that, there is information. The whole draft report that was published yesterday is located there, and you can open that and read through it. And we want your feedback. And so there's also an online feedback form on that website, and you can click on that and answer some of the questions and provide general feedback or specific feedback as whatever is your way of providing input into making the State Water Plan everything it should be. And if that's not a comfortable way for you to provide feedback, you're welcome to just email us comments. There's an email address on the screen right now. We are looking for all that feedback to be sent back to us by the end of September, the 30th of September, so that the task force can gather all those and try to incorporate your suggestions into the final report. So going back to where do we see the future of the State Water Plan? We talked a little bit earlier about how the State Water Plan was different this time. And so where do we go from here? After today or after the next few months when we finalize that State Water Plan, we're hoping that this task force gets funded. Right now, as Wes mentioned, this has sort of been a grassroots. We've all been volunteering our time. The agencies have been supporting and providing staffing to work on this. But in the first rounds of plans, the task force was funded, and it did provide a method to do all that tracking and actually complete the recommendations that are set forth in this report. And as I mentioned, the task force and the committees will continue to meet. The task force currently meets quarterly, and those committees meet as needed, depending on what's going on with their topics. And then we're hopeful that the General Assembly will fund these recommendations. The report never prioritizes the recommendations, and that's on purpose, because we recognize that some, not only are the costs variable, and it depends on what budgets and available funds, but it also just depends on regions and different areas of the state and priorities. So it's really impossible to prioritize on a statewide level. So the plan is to just work directly with the General Assembly and get the funds where we can and just get moving on those recommendations. We're going to continue updating that website with minutes are always available from all the task force meetings. Whenever we're going to, in the future, talk about our status report, all that will be on the website. I've got something in the middle called IWIC launches. And as you read the report, you'll see there's a big recommendation in there. It's called the information or the Water Information Center. And that's a recommendation that was in the previous iteration of the plan that never quite gathered enough support or steam to get that launched. And so the recommendation in this State Water Plan is to generate this information center that's housed in the University of Illinois. Looks like I lost my screen again, or internet, but I'll just keep talking because I'm familiar with that slide. And I guess I'll add, we will post this presentation on the website. So anything that you missed, you'll be able to go ahead and look at that posting of it, if you want to just try. So meanwhile, this information center is going to be a hub of information. As I mentioned, a lot of agencies are working on a lot of different programs that overlap. And we recognize there's a lot of data, a lot of information out there, a lot of maps, a lot of models, a lot of just specific data. And what we're hoping is to house that all in one location. So to help both the general public and also help the different agencies share that information in a much easier format. And so again, that's a recommendation, and we're hoping that hub or that Water Information Center launches so that we can continue to share information about the State Water Plan and all those recommendations, and that would be an ideal location to do so. And then within the University of Illinois, I should mention that it is part of the state water survey, and they've been also recommending that particular information center as our own internal recommendation for their programs. So we do have the support, at least we think at the agency level. Of course, we need funding and we need legislative support, but we're confident that we can get that resolved in this particular iteration of the state water plan. The next thing that I mentioned is measuring results, and we've been pretty hard on the task force leaders to make sure that the recommendations that they put forth are broad but also specific. It's a challenge because we don't want it to be so specific that they're not able to accomplish something if it needs to change over time. But we also don't want it to be so vague that there's no way to know if they've accomplished anything. So the idea was to come up with some sort of way to whenever you made a recommendation, we want those committees and task force leaders to be able to measure and report and make the entire process more transparent to the audience, to the General Assembly, and to the public. And then, as we mentioned, not only do we need funding, we need support with new legislation. So we're hopeful that the General Assembly, along with working with the public and stakeholders and the task force, can get some of these new legislative policies passed. We mentioned before, we're going to keep providing annual and hopefully quarterly status reports of all the different recommendations, and we hope to update the report every 10 years. So again, we need your help. We want you to provide that draft or to provide feedback to the draft report. We want you to share this opportunity with others. We recognize that there's a large group of stakeholders out there and people interested in this, but we might not be reaching everybody that we need to. So please share the website links, share the information about the remaining outreach, and continue sharing any of these status updates, especially for areas that you care about. And I would add that as these committees and work continues, you are welcome at any time to reach out to those leaders. All that information's on the website. You're welcome to reach out to those leaders, make sure that your voice is heard, make sure that your particular issue or concern is being addressed. And again, all that information and the contact is on the website. And then as we move forward, just like always, if there's a particular issue or recommendation that you feel strongly about, reach out to your legislators and to get that support and funding that we need to move forward. So the remaining report schedule, we're in August, we're having these public meetings right now. As I mentioned, we were hoping to close the public comments at the end of September. We have a few more task force meetings, and I'm assuming we will be having committee meetings in that interim. But the ultimate goal is to publish the final report in November. So definitely keep your eye out to that webpage, and hopefully by November you should be able to see that final report. But again, remember, it's a snapshot in time. It's where we stand today, and we're hoping that this is going to be a little bit more live and changing as we move forward. Here's just that website. Again, if you go to this link, all that information will be there. But sometimes people don't save websites, so we found it's pretty easy to just type in Illinois State Water Plan into your browser, and you should be able to get that website. Oh, that's all you're doing? Okay. Okay, so sorry for the pause. I'm trying to remember what the last slide is. I believe it's opening it up to questions, but just give me one more second and we'll go from there. Oh, no, it's not questions, it's thank you. It's thank you to everyone that's on this call today. Thank you to all the stakeholders, the committee members, the task force, everybody. There's been so many people that have provided input and direction for the state water plan. we apologize if you have and you're not up there. Certainly reach out to us. And we couldn't do it without everybody's help, and we really appreciate it. And so now I am going to go open up to questions. I'm going to go ahead and get out of this and see if we can go. We did.
Yep, so we'll go ahead and go back. I know there may have been some questions that came up that we may have lost as a result of the loss of the signal. So if you want to re-enter those, or maybe if I could get Steve or Christy or somebody to maybe reiterate or copy and paste those back in, feel free to go ahead and raise your hand if you'd like to unmute.
Yes.
That's also welcome as well. So again, we'll just take a few minutes. If you have any questions, feel free to unmute. Again, I apologize for the technical difficulties. And I think I have somebody unmuted, so.
Yeah, well, it's Chris Davis. Hey, when I was identifying questions, I think somebody had their hand up. I think they might have been wanting to ask something, and then somebody else had asked if there was an opportunity to ask a question while Tara was getting back and reestablished. So it may be that she answered the question after the initial request to ask a question happened. So for me, I don't have anything. And Tara and everyone, well done on remembering your slide presentation as it was flipping in and out. You did good.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Yeah, unfortunately, again, I apologize for those technical difficulties. That's the disadvantage of coming into to a new location and not having the ability to test it beforehand. So I think there was a comment that a question got wiped out. Okay, Michelle did confirm that her question was answered. Okay, very good. We'll just pause for another couple moments, make sure nobody has any other questions, or see if anybody has any other questions. Feel free to either unmute or raise your hand or type it in the chat. That's fine. I will remind you all that this presentation will be posted on that State Water Plan Task Force. If there are some parts that may have cut in and out and you wanted to see again, we did record our presentation from yesterday afternoon, which will be posted to the website, and we will be having another presentation on Monday at 10 a.m. At the Department of Ag in Springfield, Illinois on the fairgrounds. So nice thing about being in person, you don't have to worry about the technical issues. So I'm not seeing any other questions. With that, I'll just want to thank you all again for attending, especially our task force members who hopped on in case there's any questions pertaining to their section, and for all the general public who has interest in this initiative we're undertaking. So again, thank you and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
You did good. Thank you, guys. Have a good night and safe travels.
Thank you.
Thank you.